Every now and again I approach a game that I'm going to be looking at with what I can only call dread. In fact, the next game I will be looking at is another game that I am dreading looking at, based on fact I'll get to when I get there. But the main reason I was dreading looking at this video is I had no idea how long this video is going to be. I really don't. I have no intention of stopping talking until I'm done, so you have been warned. There have been a few instances in the past where I have told my viewers that I genuinely recommend they pick up whatever the game is I'm talking about, because I believe it is of such a level of quality, of presentation, that it deserves to be shared, and I've never quite explained why fully, which I think I feel this is a good time to do so. I have often said that eating food in general is better enjoyed as a social experience. Being able to sit down at a nice meal and say to yourself, this is really excellent food is nice, but being able to say to your friend or family or whoever happens to be sitting next to you and say, this food is amazing, here, try this, and sharing in that enjoyment, in that moment with someone else is awesome, in my opinion. I have also gone on record as saying that I believe that gamers are social creatures, that gaming indeed is something that, when done properly, I should say, can be a very enjoyable social experience. It's one of the reasons I still play D&D decades later, But the same analogy applies so well. When you encounter a game that is so far beyond the level of quality that you generally see from so much, even after all this time. There are two reasons I haven't mentioned as to why I wanted to go ahead and replay Half-Life 2 for this. One, admittedly the selfish reason. I wanted to play it again. I just wanted to. It was such a wonderful game, and I loved having the reason to go and pick it up again. The second reason, though, is one of my biggest definers for whether or not a game is still good is it good? Can I still enjoy it now as much as I did then? Can I still go back and play, Mario Brothers 3? Can I still go back and play Legend of Zelda or Legend of Zelda 2, Link to the Past? Can I go still play these older games, especially on the PC, because a lot of the older PC games were arguably worse than the console games of their era, because console games had already been doing this for a while and had a leg up on PC games. So, it's like N64 games. In fact, I tend to refer to that as the N64 ratio. It's a lot harder to go back and play Mario 64 than it is to go back and play Mario World, because Mario World was top of the line. And not just for the time, but it was done well. It was done very engagingly, whereas Mario 64, both at the time and now, is kind of like, I'm getting a little off topic. It is nevertheless very gratifying, very relieving. It is a relief to go back and play a game that you believed was beautiful, amazing, fantastic, and replay it and still enjoy it just as much, if not more. One of the things I've always aimed for with these videos is to help other people think and find new ways to enjoy things that they either already enjoy or have never thought about enjoying. I get the comment, I picked up this game on your recommendation and it's amazing, or I've played this game a dozen times but I never thought about it this way. Every time I see one of those comments, it makes me smile, because it means I have succeeded in this task of sharing, in this joy. I am a person who does not find joy in many things, to be honest. There's my family, there is my video games, and there is my music. And basically that is it. I am not complaining. Let us make this clear. I only state this to highlight the stark reality of the situation, that these three things are important to me, in relative order, actually, of the way I listed them. Obviously my family comes before sitting down and playing StarCraft. Duh, if you'll forgive me for saying so. But it is my belief that things that are enjoyed, things that bring joy, should be shared. So I want to say, with the most heartfelt emotion, with the most amount of energy and passion that I am capable of vocalizing with these primitive sounds that I make with my mouth right now, please please do yourself a favor and play this game. Half-Life 2 is amazing, and it should be shared. This joy should be shared. Now I'm gonna put a stamp on this, okay? Half-Life 2 has various types of horror in it. I'll talk about these more in depth later, but there is the visceral type of horror, there is the creepy psychological type of horror, there is the long-term ramification type of horror. All three of these are very present in this game. If you do not enjoy these, you'll probably not enjoy this game. It is a very action-oriented game at times. It has puzzles at times. It is a serious examination of what humanity is, pretty much all the time, basically. There is a great deal to this game for what is effectively a first-person shooter. The level of depth and complexity is nothing short of amazing, but if you do not find any of the things that I just mentioned enjoyable, of course, I don't mean what I said earlier. But if you do, please take some time out, sometime in your life, if you have not played this, and play this game. And if you have, I implore you to play it again. Half-Life 2. I have so many things I want to start on. I really do. Let's start on something that I was originally going to leave towards the end. I decided to do a little bit different ending to the way I'm going to do this. One of the common criticisms that comes up of anybody who is a fan of anything, this applies to video games as well, but music, art, movies, books, just about any form of media you come across, there's this idea that people of a certain age group, that is to say people who are considered old, or at least a generation or two out of date at the current time, only like the old stuff because of nostalgia or because they're stupid, basically, right? Let me state this avidly, because I've been accused of this myself, of course. Many people have in my age group. Let me make this absolutely clear. I do not prefer older games because they're older, nor do I prefer them because I look back at them through rose-tinted goggles. As I've said before, if a game does not hold up later on, if I do not play that game now and do not enjoy it as much, it is not as good of a game in my opinion. I'm very frank about this. Admittedly, I do tend to have many older games in my top, whatever. But why? You're probably wondering, sitting there, why is this coming up now? Because one of the questions I was asked a long time ago, and it does come up many times, and I keep ignoring it, kind of teasing with it. I'm going to finally answer it. Do I think Half-Life 1 or Half-Life 2 is the superior game? Half-Life 1, without question, without exception, without hesitation, had a bigger impact on gaming as a whole. Without there's so few people that could possibly argue that. What it did to gaming as a media, as an art form, was something that is difficult to define because of the sheer ramifications of the long-reaching effects that it had. Half-Life 2, by contrast, had very little impact on gaming. While they did have innovations in the way they presented their story and in the actual technology they did. For example, just to use one example right off the top of my head, excuse me. Half-Life 2 graphically is very impressive, not because it has high-resolution textures and a very high polygon count meshes, but because it was animated beautifully. Even now, picking it up just a few days ago, well, actually it's been about a week now, since I first picked up Half-Life 2 and actually started playing it again. Even now, I am still impressed by the way that the people actually emoted properly. Obviously, there's some glitches, obviously there's some bugs. I only encountered like 3, actually, during my whole playthrough. But these people would actually talk and emote and be like, and they'd actually do this, and they would have actual eye movements, and their faces would actually have expressions and stuff. It was phenomenal that we have very, very, very few games have even equaled that level of progress in the modern era. And this is a game that's 7 or 8 or however many years old at this point. So Half-Life 2 definitely is ahead of its time, was ahead of its time, is still debatably ahead of its time. No question, but did it change the genre? Did it change gaming? No, of course not. It didn't do anything. I mention that because I feel that when you're trying to talk about the ineffable quality that defines whether or not a game it is in relation to another game, that sort of thing has to be taken into account. For example, if I were to compare Wolfenstein 3D to Doom, let's use a direct example, as to which game is superior, Wolfenstein 3D certainly gets its props for having basically started the FPS genre, whereas Doom certainly gets its own props for having basically brought it to the masses, so to speak. And I don't mean that as a negative way, before anyone thinks. Doom was popular. Doom helped push PC gaming into something that was more viable, was something that was still being considered to be relatively unlikely at the time. So both get their own props for their changes and their historical significance. However, at the end of the day, I feel that I have to look at a game in comparison to another game, regardless, not regardless of that thing, because I do have to take that into account, but in all aspects. Gameplay, design, presentation, story, impact, personal impact, all of the above. So, I'm sorry for babbling on for a little bit here, but the answer to the question is I think Half-Life 2 is a superior game, and I'd think that 20 times in a row. There's actually no question in my mind that Half-Life 2 is a vastly, indeed, titanically superior game. And I'll talk about several of the reasons why in just a moment here. Oh, pardon me, hang on. Was there anything else I wanted to talk about right at the beginning? That's one of the next things. I guess I could move that next. What's this note? I have quite a few notes on this game. Okay. Let's go ahead and segue this into this next point then. We'll go ahead and get directly into it. When you are making a sequel in any format, video game, book, movie, television show, whatever, there's basically two generally accepted ways to do so properly. One is to take what you had and the things that made it good, because obviously most sequels, I'm talking about sequels for something that was relatively well received, by the way. Whatever it was that make it good, and improve upon or add to it. Try to maintain that core of whatever it is, but instead of having, if I can do a really, really stupid analogy here, right here. I don't even know if you can see this. Hang on. Give me just a moment. Okay, can you see that? I just scribbled a little star right there on the thing, okay? Now, bear with me. Pretend that's Half-Life, okay? Now, there's two ways you can do this. One, you can add onto it in a way that doesn't take away from the original. And doing so means that the core is still there. I could keep going, but I don't want to go too far with this. The core is still there, and it's still obviously, but now there's more. It's been fleshed out. There's more detail. There's more advances. It is overall considered to be superior to the original, right? That's the first method. The second method is to do this. Now, this isn't anything specific. Let's get it up. There we go. And my point in mentioning that is you go into a completely different direction entirely. You try something completely different, completely new, rather than trying to ape anything you did previously. Now, it's interesting to note from a behind-the-scenes perspective that Valve actually did both. They made the sequel that was completely different, and then they made the sequel that was the original but better. The former is, of course, a game many of you have probably played called Portal, and the latter is, of course, Half-Life 2. Interesting thought process when you think about it, again, from the development perspective. But anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. There are very few games that actually pull off this balance very well, admittedly. But every time I see one that actually does this properly, it just makes me want to sing. Because when you have a game that was amazing, and then you add to it and you improve it, for me personally, this is getting a little bit personal, so I apologize, but for me, disappointment in the gaming industry is something I've gotten extremely used to. I could name a dozen examples of things that are happening right now that are disappointing and discouraging and just make me want to go, because it's such a waste. And there is so much potential there that they could be using and that they're not. And that bothers me, and I get used to that feeling. Thus, every time I see a company or a game that comes out that does the exact opposite of that, that actually reaches that potential, that actually does something with it, and actually goes somewhere with it. It's the exact opposite reaction. I want to sing, I want to laugh, I want to dance. Yes! Yes! Thank you! I'm not going to name any specific examples because I don't want people to judge me here on those. But Half-Life 2 was without question this. Everything that was absolutely phenomenal about Half-Life, and then some. Now, I feel like I'm bashing this point. I'm going to go into a lot more detail as I go on. I'm really going to go into this game. I'm actually not going to go into it in full depth because, well, what I was doing. This is my first page of notes, right? Really, really, really chicken scratches. This was my second page of notes. Now, what I was doing is every time I noticed a detail, is what I called it, I went ahead and scrolled it down as a note. I actually did not get very far into the game before I decided to stop doing this, because there were so many that I was interrupting my gameplay experience to scribble them down. I'll talk about that more in detail later. But suffice it to say that there was just so much that I had to rein myself back in. Otherwise, this video is going to be 5 hours long. And I don't think my vocal cords would like me if I did that. I'm not even sure my fans would like me if I did that. God, 5 hours about Half-Life 2. I might as well just put up a piece of paper for 5 hours that says, "This game is good, please play it." But let's really talk about Half-Life 2. Let's talk about something first that I really wanted to share with you. I mentioned back in Half-Life that so many people had different perspectives of Gordon Freeman. Now, that's obviously in here in spades as well. I'm going to save that for the second half of this point, okay? I want to share a specific theory, a specific viewpoint, a specific perception of Gordon Freeman that really, I wish I thought of it, basically. Picture Gordon Freeman as being just an ordinary guy, assistant, whatever he was, PhD, and MIT, that kind of thing, and going into his normal workday, and then there's an accident, and this horrible thing happens. Now, within this particular perception, obviously the aliens and Zen and all that is actually quite real. There is one exception to that. I'm going to get to that in a minute, but I just wanted to stress this isn't someone. The person who put forth this theory is not saying that Gordon Freeman is just completely psychotic. Rather, well, what happened when the incident occurred and when everything went to hell, that's not the traumatic event if you really think about it. The traumatic event from a human perspective is when you leave, barely having escaped the cascade reaction, and you leave the office and you start to see strange alien creatures all over the place, and you start to see your murdered colleagues, people you knew every day and worked with for however long, smeared across the walls, literally. That's the traumatic event. And I mention that because it's not until after that you see G-Man for the real time. Now, yes, you do see G-Man in the entrance. I know. Let's just bear with me here. The point being that as you're going through the game, and as Gordon Freeman's going through there, he basically builds what is effectively a second personality on top of his, very Fight Club style thing here. It literally a completely segregate personality where Gordon Freeman becomes the hero, becomes the action guy, becomes the one who is not going to back down, who is not going to submit. And throughout the game, he keeps seeing the G-Man. Now, as he gets to the end of the game, he reaches the point where he has defeated Nyland and stopped everything, and he is confronted by the G-Man for the first time, and it is revealed in this perception that the G-Man is in fact a figment of his imagination, basically, that this is an aspect of his shattered consciousness, telling him that now that his job is done, the personality that is the hero's job is done, it's time for him to, rest, but maybe there will be more work for him in the future, that kind of thing, right? And so that personality gets subsumed to the point where it basically stops existing, and the actual Gordon Freeman, the original Gordon Freeman, comes to the light, which is just some scared little, scientist who has no idea what's going on. Fast forward about 17 years or whatever it is, they actually name it, but it's been almost 2 decades between Half-Life 1 and Half-Life 2. The very first thing we see is the G-Man. Beautiful entrance. It just lays everything out there right at the front, and you get hints and bits and pieces of exactly how screwed up everything is without actually getting details. Very, very excellent storytelling, I might add. But the G-Man is literally telling you it's time to rise and shine and to smell the ashes. And it is at that moment that Gordon Freeman's heroic personality resurfaces. And from that point until the end of Half-Life 2 is him having become, the Freeman again, and charging through and fighting just insurmountable odds and succeeding despite all odds to the contrary, and finally succeeding at the end. And you get to the end, and in this player's perspective, yes, I know the series keeps going, but in the perspective of this, because this was when the game was, still new, Gordon Freeman dies right at the end there. And as he's dying, he sees the G-Man again, who basically tells him, that's enough, it's time to rest, we'll go ahead and let this one sit for a while. Which is both horrifying and incredibly just emotional. I don't even know how to put that. It's a beautiful perception, but all the imagination that went into that aside, the main reason I wanted to share this with you is because it really speaks to that storytelling style I was talking about earlier, about how you, the gamer, is the person who is basically deciding the story you're viewing. Not because there's a dialogue option, not because you've got the little Mass Effect wheel, not because there's, go this path or that path to get the good ending or the bad ending, just because of the way the linear game is being presented, you can see different stories going on there, different interpretations of the events. And that is some amazing storytelling right there. I'm going to go ahead and segue this into the question that was asked of me. What is my Freeman? What is my Gordon Freeman? Probably shouldn't surprise you the kind of Freeman I play, but I want to summarize it by a single event that happened in this playthrough, as I was playing through right now. It was right about after the point in which I'd picked up my first gun, and I was still basically using the crowbar because I was still gathering up ammunition because, I was playing on hard difficulty, and that game is kind of hard. And I get to the point where I'm going through the sewers trying to escape, trying to get to the point where I could get the little land buggy thing, whatever heck it was called. And I hear a woman's voice acted, saying, "Help me, please help me." And without even thinking about it, I ran in the direction of the voice. And I came across a woman who was being beaten by these two Combine soldiers. And she had enough time to get out the words, "We haven't even done anything to you, why are you doing this?" Something like that, before I was literally already on them, wailing on them with the crowbar as hard as I could, wailing on the troops, obviously, in order to save her. That is my Freeman. Someone who did not even hesitate nor think for a millisecond to charge into the fray and save those people, because that's simply so powerfully the instinct he feels. Admittedly, there's a bit of myself in that, but I'm sure we could all say that to some extent or another. And I mention this especially because I actually ended up taking basically the first hits I took this whole game. It was the first time I'd really taken damage to date, was because I charged in there so recklessly and so heedlessly, and probably shouldn't have, in all honesty. But that's my point. That mindset, that mentality, is where my Freeman's at. And I've heard several different other kinds of Freemans. Let me expand on this point a little bit. There are many instances within this game where something happens that it is clearly designed to make you react, but never is it outlined how you should react. Let me give you a minor example. There's a point right after the lighthouse, literally right after it, where you go out onto the cliff, and as you're going out on the cliff, a couple of Combine soldiers peer over the edge and start shooting at you from the little outpost you were just at. And one of the carrier ships, whose name I can't think of, is taking off with your buggy, and it buzzes right in front of you. You're obviously supposed to notice this. What is your Freeman's reaction to that event? Are you thinking, "Ah, oh, there goes my ride"? Are you thinking, "Oh, great, this gives me an excellent way, I'm finally rid of that thing"? Are you thinking, "Oh God, this gives me just even more, this burns me up even more than I already was. I'm going to destroy those guys"? Are you thinking, "How did those Combine troopers get there? We held the base. We were holding the line. I fought back wave after wave"? Are you thinking, "Maybe all that fighting I just did in order to save this point was for nothing"? Are you thinking, "Those people just paid for my continuing down this path with their lives"? There's so many different scenes like that. I could not possibly. If I was to literally go down and list them all, it would be page upon page of scenes just like that are subtler and more in-depth than they really look at first glance, and the reactions that they engender are nothing short of phenomenal. I know that I've only talked with a few people personally about the reactions to certain scenes, but every single one of them has been different than my own, which is kind of my point, if you know what I mean. Let's go ahead and talk about the next point here. Let's go ahead and move on. I mentioned earlier that there are several kinds of horror that are being portrayed in Half-Life 2. One of them is the extremely normal horror. This is something that's difficult to pull off, and yet immensely terrifying when you do it properly. I'm trying to think of another example other than Half-Life 2 itself, but most of the beginning part of the game and certain parts later on are extremely normal, extremely mundane. There is nothing out of the ordinary going on. You understand what I mean? There is a atmosphere of oppression. There is an atmosphere of tension. You don't actually see all but like one or two examples of what's actually happening, and that's the point. Everything seems like a completely ordinary day with a little bit of a different fashion sense and some difficulties with the architecture, but otherwise everything is also wrong. It's a form of uncanny valley, actually, where things have become so normal that they're actually off kilter. You understand what I mean? It is a very quiet form of horror. The very where implication and thought process and your own mind provide the horror rather than them showing you anything horrifying. There are so many little details. So many of the little details I'll mention here in just a second were from this section of the game because that's the beginning of the game and that's when I stopped writing them. But it just served to fill out this world. And I want to stress something. Until we saw the making of videos, until we saw the background information, until Half-Life Episode 1 and 2 came out, we knew extremely little going into Half-Life 2. At the end of Half-Life 1, we know that there's this place called Zen, and that it's something called the Border World, and that the G-Man is involved with it being taken over in some way. That's basically it. We are given so few details as to what happened. Then Half-Life 2 starts, and we are given almost less. Everything we discern from Half-Life 2's story as we go is from the details, not the plot progressing itself. You follow me? Everything we learn about what has happened over the last 2 decades, or however long it is stuff we have to pick up on ourselves. Yeah, now yes, other information, other sources have filled in the details in many ways, but the fact remains, while you're playing that game, you know nothing. I've talked before about the concept of a viewpoint character. Tidus in FF10 is probably one of the better examples of that I've seen. In Half-Life 2, you are the viewpoint character. You know just as much as Gordon Freeman does, and that's nothing. And it really adds to the paranoia. That's the word I want to go with. The paranoia that you feel for that whole first part of the game. And it doesn't help that you don't have any weapons or equipment or even your HEV suit. You're just walking around in a blue leotard just like everyone else is. I'm going to segue that into something else here I wanted to mention briefly. I've heard some people complain about how weak they felt towards the beginning of the game. I actually think that's extremely in character and was done very much on purpose for several reasons. The first and the foremost I've already mentioned, to help with the atmosphere of the first part of the game. The whole part up until the point in which Alex saves you is nothing but establishment and establishment and establishment, and it just builds and builds and builds upon itself. And the fact that you literally have nothing. You don't even have a health bar yet. You don't have a HUD. You don't have a weapon. You have the ability to pick up items. You know, you can do this with the E button and pull them around and stuff, or whatever it is on the console. I obviously was playing it on the PC, but, you know, that's all you got. That's it. And that not only adds to that atmosphere, but it brings it to my second point. Gordon Freeman is one of those characters that is so amazing because of their mentality and because they are exceptional tool users. One of the other best examples of this I can think of that most people I'm sure will agree with me immediately is Commander Shepard over in the Mass Effect series. Commander Shepard is certainly an extremely exceptional individual, probably in the far end of the bell curve, or you know what I mean. But ultimately, they are extremely exceptional, you know, in their mentality and in their focus and the way they present themselves, and extremely good tool users. You see the comparison here. It's very obvious when you think about it. If you take Commander Shepard, took away all her crew, or his crew, and took away all their equipment, they'd be a little bit better off than your normal human, because again, how far into the bell curve. But then the same could be said of Gordon Freeman. The moment you put them up against anything real, they crumble. And so you actually feel helpless for the first part of this game because you are. And it isn't until Alex comes by and you see this wonderful little section and you get introduced to all sorts of little awesome little details. I'll get to that in more detail later. And then you finally get the HEV suit. And then that beautiful scene, which I'm sorry, I absolutely cheered at the first time I saw it. I even cheered at it this time through, where Barney goes up and says, "Here." And I forget how he says it, but it's basically you dropped something, and he drops the crowbar. And it's like, yes! And that's one of those moments that really was clearly designed for fans of the first game. But I think it is fully awesome because, keep in mind, I'm on hard difficulty. And for the first section of the game, okay, let me just lay this out for you, alright? First section of the game, you're completely powerless, okay? Nothing you can do. Then you have exposition, this little section here, beautiful little section. Then you get the crowbar, okay? For this gigantic chunk of the game, you have just become Death himself. You have become a destroyer of worlds with a crowbar. And if you think I'm kidding, then you don't know what I'm talking about in full, because my God, man. And then there's a few other sections I'll get to much later, because I want to cover this in a semi-linear fashion. But the point being, I would actually charge at enemies who were chasing me for much of that earlier section, because I could destroy them with the crowbar, and that would mean more ammunition, and I knew I'd need it. I knew for a fact that when I got to Ravenholm, I wanted basically full clips on every weapon I had, and I was right. Admittedly, I knew this game and I knew where I was going with that. But even if I hadn't, there was just this sort of joy in the fact that after in the wake of that oppression, in the wake of seeing these people be hurt and injured, in the wake of watching and being unable to do anything to help anyone, let alone yourself, being handed a simple tool, just a crowbar, nothing more, meant all the difference in the world. And that's why that scene was so powerful. That's why it was so amazing, and that's why I cheered, because I knew what it meant this time through. Details. Let's go ahead and talk about details now. Let's get into that, okay? There we go. I was writing down every little detail that I found was amazing. No, I want to stress why I found this amazing. Keep in mind, this is 7 or so years ago, okay? Every time you put in a detail like, actually, let me give you an example right here, okay? In most video games, this right here would be a single mesh. This is one solid object. It has been textured so it looks like these pages are separate, but this is not possible because it's one single mesh. Half-Life 2, one of the reasons it is so amazing is this would be the mesh, and this whole part here would be animated like this. This is what I mean by details. Every single one of them, I'll get to what that means in a second. Right at the beginning, you see a soda machine, which you can actually punch the button and have soda pop out. Not only is that awesome in its own right, but as with so many of these details, there's a hidden layer there. One of the things that is mentioned early on is that they put something in the water, and one of the things that is hinted at often is that most of the people basically can't resist the Combine. I'm not talking about force of arms. I'm talking about it's not in them. You know people in the modern era here now tend to be lazy and don't want to take the trash out, or don't want to go out and get a better job, or don't want to go out and try and be ambitious or something like that, right? Imagine that taken to the nth degree because they've actually been chemically poisoned to be like that. They actually have some sort of depressant within the water, which is freely distributed. You get where I'm going with this. So that machine is not only just, oh, that's cool, but then you pause for a second and you think about how absolutely horrifying it is that they're giving away for free this little drink, which was probably flavored, probably tastes good and everything, that is designed to chemically depress you so you are less likely to do anything to oppose them. This is going back to that really just paranoia horror that I was talking about earlier. But let's move on. There are so many people that are just talking through that first train station. Most of them don't even acknowledge your existence. Some do, but some of them are talking to each other. Some of them are waiting in line for their ration disposition or thing. Some of them are literally walking back and forth talking about how the trains come but never leave. And there's all sorts of signs that don't mean anything, especially if you haven't played the game before, that are talking about how people are being put on a train to Nova Prospect. Now, if you have played the game, you know exactly what that means and exactly what that implies. But it's right there, and it's so quiet, and all you know is that there's something wrong about that, something bad about it, and all the people talking to each other add to that. There's another wonderful little section that happens right after that where you're going down the hall because Barney is taking you there. You don't know this yet, and you turn to the left, or you can turn to the left, and there's a guy who's saying, I don't understand. Why am I being pulled off? I have my papers and everything. And the Combine trooper notices you looking in, walks up to the door, grabs the slot that you're looking in through, and shuts it on your face. That's not an easy thing to code in, and again, it is all in service of the story, all of the aspects of the story. I've talked about this before. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Then you keep going, and there's a chair, and this is bloody subtle. No pun intended. One of the more intimidating things you can do to someone is intimate that you're going to do something rather than actually do it. For example, this is a direct example from Star Trek for anyone who's wondering. You take up a knife and you look at it for a moment, and it's very sharp and it's very wicked looking. And you mention how, of course, you're going to be getting some information on the person, and then you ask almost casually how their health is. Any physical defects we need to know about, that kind of thing. Now, he's not going to actually cut you with this knife because he doesn't have to. The implication of this violence and the fact that he has now gotten your brain going, your imagination going onto what it would be like to have this knife. You understand me? That implication is more powerful than him actually stabbing you. There's a subtlety there. There's a refinement there, as horrible as it is. So the very next thing that happens is you walk into this room, and there's a chair which is pristine. Not pristine, but there's nothing wrong with it. It's just a chair that has obviously been moved into that place. And underneath the chair are splotches of blood. That's it. That's all. And all you can do when you look at that is just kind of recoil, because now your imagination is going. And the fact that it's a new chair makes it worse because your mind is thinking, oh God, what happened to the last chair? That they had to actually replace it. What happened to the person who was in that chair? You know, your brain just kind of circles around the facts it has because that's what it's designed to do. The game is absolutely full of these. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. Let's see here. This one is a really interesting type of horror that I'm not sure most people would get. And I don't mean that as an insult. I mean that as a parent. Okay? There is this thing they talk about called a suppression field. Now we find out much later in the game what the suppression field actually is. I will point out that if you are really paying attention, you'll find out what it is right at the beginning. And I'll get to that in just a second. That's actually my next point. But in general, all we know is that there's this thing called a suppression field. We go through an apartment complex where people are depressed. People are just sitting around, not moving, not looking at anything. There's a scene where the Combine soldiers are kicking in a door for one area, and most of the people who are looking at it aren't even active. They're just watching. And there's an extremely powerful moment where you happen by a woman who is sobbing into a man's arms, and the words they exchange aren't specific enough for you to get any details out of. But she says things like, what are we going to do? He says, we'll think of something. She says, I don't understand. And he says, it's okay. We'll make it work. Things like that. All of this again is engaging your brain, engaging your imagination, trying to make you think, what is this suppression field, and why? Now, to get into my next point, we find out the suppression field actually basically makes it impossible for people to mate, to have children. And in fact, one of the things we see throughout the entire game, but most especially this intro part, is there are no children whatsoever. Just about everyone around is probably the current generation, and indeed, arguably, the last generation, unless you do something about it. You see playgrounds that have long since gone into disrepair. You hear, children laughing and screams in the background and things like that. Just subtle little things. Very powerful stuff. I mentioned I would go into this next because if you're paying attention, Dr. Breen, our villain for the game, is a near omnipresent presence throughout the first part of this game, and it was done very much on purpose, and it was done very well. From a coding perspective, what they did was that no matter where you are in the game, with some exceptions, you're going to be hearing him talking. Especially if you've got headphones on, the voice will change. Maybe it's over here, maybe it's over here. But no matter where you are, there is a speaker nearby that is presenting his voice. So from a game perspective, no matter what, Breen is constantly yammering at you. From a lore perspective, it gets across the point that there is no escaping this propaganda, that it is continuous and constant and utterly, it's everywhere, it is absolutely everywhere, and there's no way to get away from it. And that's an extremely powerful image, even though it's actually an auditory thing. Very, very well done. And very indicative of the type of dystopia that we're talking about here, because this is effectively a dystopia. It's just a really, really horrifying one. There's the children thing I thought. One of the things I really love. Oh, hang on. What's this note I said here? I can't actually read my own word there. Well, I mentioned here that this place. I was talking about the uncanny valley effect earlier. One of the additional ways they get this across is visually, not just in the things that you're seeing that are actionable, things that people walking around or people getting depressed, all the things I've been talking about, but literally just the terrain. So many of the areas in this vaguely European-looking setting are a really strange combination of run down and broken down. Obviously the buildings have gone into some disrepair, but at the same time, everything is very clean. And those two things, and the contrast they build, and the contradiction that they build in your mind by itself is unsettling. And that's the point, that this whole area is just wrong, that there's something unutterably wrong about it. And the fact that they actually go to the point of visual representation thereof is amazing. There's only three more I mentioned on here. One is the news clippings. This is true for much of the game. For several points in the game, you can walk up to a news clipping and actually, read whatever the news was about. My favorite example of this is actually much later on when when Eli is introduced and you're well, not introduced, but you're physically there. You've made it to the Mesa facility, and as you're looking around, it's a brilliant way to get exposition out the door because it's very natural. It flows as you, the player, are looking around. And I didn't even remember that this happened, actually. I was just looking around the room because that's what I usually do. But as a certain area enters your view, he starts talking about it. Because Gordon Freeman has looked at that area, and now he's sharing those thoughts about that with Gordon. You follow me? So, you look at these news clippings, and you look up and you see a picture of Dr. Breen there, and a picture of the old staff and stuff like that, and Eli walks over and starts talking about it. It's an amazing way to get exposition done and to get revelations about the setting done, especially since you basically have to go out and reach for it, which also means if you don't want to, you don't have to. Absolutely amazingly done. And the final thing here is I wanted to mention is the dust on the clipboard. This was actually not only a nice touch from a humorous angle, but amazingly done. The Dr. Kleiner pulls out a little clipboard, and he looks at it, and it's really dusty because it's talking about the HEV suit, and he's like, I'll get you up to speed on your HEV suit, and he looks at it, and he blows on it, and actual dust comes flying off. Again, little details like that. Even in this case, it's mostly in the service of a joke, because he only gets like a sentence in before they're like, Doc, can we speed this up? We got some stuff to do. I loved that. And I love the details, and I wish I could have kept detailing all of them, but there were just so many, and it was slowing down the gameplay considerably for me. Now, let's talk about... what's next? Alex. I actually rather like the Alex character for one very simple reason. Well, okay, that's not true. I like her for several reasons. She's an interesting character, she's a very strong-willed character, and I like the way they present her throughout the course of the game. You also see many different sides of her. That being said, I like her primarily because the fact that she's female is totally and completely irrelevant. Now, to explain what I mean by that, if Alex had been a guy, wouldn't have changed anything. The fact that Alex is female is irrelevant to her character, and I actually rather like that. I like the fact that we have a strong character about whom the fact that she is female is completely inconsequential. You know what I mean? And I do like the fact that she is basically an action girl, not quite the equivalent of Gordon, because, Gordon is a destroyer of worlds. But in the setting, we get the very strong impression that Alex is basically the go-to person before you show up. Because so many of the people involved in the Resistance are either people who are oppressed and just fighting out desperately, people who are scientists, Barney, and Alex. So in other words, if you're paying attention, the only people who are real resistance fighters in this movement are Barney and Alex. And I really enjoyed the fact that she was portrayed in such a manner. It really helped flesh her out as a character and made me actually care about her and what happened to her. Speaking of characterization, I mentioned back in Half-Life that the voice actors and the few lines that they were given for the relatively few NPCs you interact with who are alive, and not trying to shoot you, was extremely well done in adding some characterization to a character who basically you only see once and then you move on. Half-Life 2 took that concept and ran with it. You learn so much about the named characters you meet. Every single one of them is fleshed out in their tone, in their word choice, in their actual movements, because again, we've actually got this thing going on now. And so their expression and their gesturing and the way they walk around, every single element of every character is in service of telling us who that character is, what person lies underneath. Granted, again, I'm sorry, by the way, there's going to be some spoilers here, so I really do recommend you go play the game before you watch this, but moving on. Granted, having played this game, I knew Judith Mossman was someone who was a traitor. I knew that, obviously, duh, and had been traitor for some time based on the way she was talking. However, even without that, if you're paying attention, the way she presents herself, the way she looks at you, the furtive glances and the sort of kind of a thing, and she's always looking down and to the side and not sure what to do with her hands. It's very indicative of the conflict, the guilt, and the problem there. It's incredibly well done, and so we actually learn about who these individuals are past just a name. You know what I mean? Dr. Kleiner, Barney, Alex, Edith Mossman, Eli. So many of the Vortigaunts are surprisingly well fleshed out too. There's a guy whose name I can't even remember, unfortunately. Oh shoot, did I write it down? I don't think I did. That's a shame. There is a guy who you meet who is named, who you know what? I'll get to that later because I want to talk about that later. But it's just you know what? I'll talk about it now. As you're going through the antlion portion, much further into the game, you come across two NPCs, one of whom is on the sand and one of whom is on the rock. Now, this is nothing short of brilliant. I'm sorry I keep using that word, but I feel this is true. As a developer, you have various methods at your disposal in order to get across a point to the gamer. In this case, the point to be gotten across is sand plus movement equals antlions, and that's a bad thing. Okay? We've already encountered antlions, so we know that they're a threat. That's taken care of. No problems there. But we needed to get across the no sand point, and there's so many different ways that they could approach that. And indeed, if you've looked at the raising the bar thing, you know that they tried several different methods before they settled on this one. What they ended up with was two guys who you'll never see before, never see again. One of whom dies because he's moving on the sand, and the other guy starts weeping that this man is lost, one of the finest minds of our generation, and all these things. And not only was it a brilliant way to get across the point to the gamer, but it again did that thing of fleshing out both characters and setting, because the important part is the important message here, as contrary as it may seem, is that the world doesn't revolve around you, Gordon Freeman, or the gamer, however you want to think of that. That these people had their own story that was completely segregated from yours, had nothing to do with you, and that story has now tragically been cut short. And they wanted to portray that. And that was amazing. And they did it beautifully. And this was in service of telling you, hey, fire bad. You know? Because the next section of the gameplay is basically you playing the carpet is made of lava. You know? With the sand. Don't touch the sand. You literally have to stack platforms and stuff, wood stuff, so you could hop across it in order to cross the sand. And in order to get that point across, they decided to add depth and meaning to it. Ultimately, the phrase I've been wanting to bring up this whole time, and I guess I'll get around to it finally, is raising the bar. In fact, one of the big making of videos of Half-Life 2 is called Raising the Bar, and by God, it's for good reason. For those of you who don't fully get it, let me explain. Imagine if there's this chart thing here, not a chart, just a line graph right here, of general quality of a game, okay? Now, let's go ahead and put, in my scale, I consider FF6 to be the best game of all time, right? So let's just put an arbitrary limit right here. This is FF6, okay? Right up here. Now, in general, expectations vary, obviously. Most people, such as myself, tend to keep low expectations. Some people keep high expectations and then complain about it. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm sorry. I don't. You'll notice I use my word choice as neutrally as I can. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that outset. But even at this point, the bar is something that the developers and the gamers both set. And for Half-Life, that bar was pretty high. The mentality they approached Half-Life 2 with was, here is the bar for what people expect of us from Half-Life 2, from the sequel to one of the greatest PC games of all time. How do we raise the bar? You understand me? How do we move this up? This is why they have put so much attention into detail. This is why this game has so many facets to it. This is a first-person shooter that has an action chase sequence on a vehicle, has careful platforming, has there's a sequence where you're going under the underside of a bridge, which trains occasionally go over, which makes everything shake like crazy. I'm going to admit something about myself that I usually don't. I have a problem with heights. I don't actually have true, I actually can't think of what it's called, but blank phobia, because I know what a phobia actually feels like, and I do have one of those. No, I'm not telling you what that is. But I do have a problem with heights, and that extends to video games. Always has. So when I'm in this really, really several hundred foot tall bridge sequence, which I'm literally jumping through the scaffolding to get through, as the whole thing is shaking as trains go overhead, I'm just like, oh my god. And I mention this because this isn't just platforming. There is just platforming earlier, hopping across the cliffside, or trying to get to a particular part of, going through the sewers, having to do the little physics puzzles. This was true terror. And it's very suspenseful and very tense. Even if I had not been in that circumstance, I know several people who, when they get to that sequence, quick save constantly because it's just, you know, this game has that. This game has severely intense action sequences. I'll talk about that later as well. This game has wide-scale battles. This game has creepy, quiet sections of just, oh my god. This game has a sequence where you're on a buggy which has a gun with unlimited ammo on it. This game has, you know what? I'm going to stop here because that's my point. I could just kind of keep going with the different methods, with the different presentations, with the different styles, arguably with the different genres that this game approaches, all while being a first-person shooter. That's raising the bar right there. And yeah, wow. Now let's rewind a little bit. There's one thing I felt like I wanted to comment on because this is just a theory of myself. Um, I haven't mentioned that point yet, have I? I'll get to that later. In fact, I'll wrap that up towards the end. If for anybody who's wondering why I'm not looking at episode 1 and 2, I'll mention that towards the end. Now then, I need to make a note of putting that in the thing. Early on, you enter the portal, and Lamar, whatever his name is, the beaked head crab, disrupts everything by pulling one of the power cables. Okay. Now, normally you'd expect yourself to just kind of be, atomized as a result of that, especially given all the problems that they mention and, the poor cat. But that's not what happens. First, you end up on some random beach. Okay. Then you end up at the target destination, but you're not actually forming fully. That's odd. Then something happens which I think is more significant than most people would probably place on. You end up in Dr. Breen's office. Statistically speaking, that is improbable to the point of ridiculous, especially since, as we later learn, Dr. Breen's office is basically like a mile and a half or two or more in the air, in the very top of the Citadel. And that guy's office, you didn't teleport in the Citadel, you didn't teleport into a bulkhead, you didn't teleport in thin air, you teleported right in front of Dr. Breen himself. And the result of that was Dr. Breen and the advisors became aware of the fact that Gordon Freeman was back on the playing field. And that changes the tone of everything that happens for the entire rest of the game. If it wasn't for that, it is entirely probable and indeed possible that Freeman would have been able to sleepwalk his way through most of the rest of the game because they wouldn't have had that advance warning. It is my theory that the G-Man, with whatever extra-dimensional powers he happens to have, which he has demonstrated on many occasions, is the one responsible for that, is the one responsible for stirring up the hornet's nest. The why is a little harder to answer. I could think of several reasons why, and I'm not going to speculate because we know so little about it. But that is my theory on the matter, and I welcome any other theories anyone else has, other than just random chance, because shrug. um, but I think that was done on purpose, if nothing else, because it was an excellent way to show us not only the stakes, but immediately after that, it gave us a scene which made us feel absolutely awesome. And it goes in. Okay, I mentioned the whole first part of the game, you're completely helpless. Then you get the suit, then you get the crowbar, right? As you get the crowbar, or the scene immediately prior to that, I forget, Barney it points out the Citadel and points out the fact that he's never seen it lit up like that. That he has never seen them thrown up like that. And you, the player, know why, even though Gordon doesn't tell them why, because you've just been teleported to Brainard's office. You know why that is. And that means that the Citadel, the Combine, and Dr. Breen are so scared of you that they just went onto full bore alert because he saw you for a second. And that knowledge combined with that crowbar and everything I talked about earlier about how you have just become the unholy death and doom lord of destruction really complements it. I'd like to talk about something else in here while I'm talking about it. This is a detail as well. Most games, when they have something absolutely massive that they want to portray in a distance, they use either a layered skybox or actually a part of the skybox in order to actually display it in the background, right? Half-Life 2 did something absolutely brilliant. I know I keep using that word. They actually had a three-dimensional render, a mesh, of the Citadel, okay? Now, actually making that thing to scale would be ludicrous, because it is gargantuan. But what they did in every scene that you see the Citadel is that there is a model of the Citadel that is in such a manner that no matter where you're looking at it, okay, let me take this back a bit. You have this little area you can be in. In other words, there's only so many angles you can see this at. So you've got this one little spot here. So from that spot, it looks like it's miles away and gargantuan, right? If you were to use a no-clip code to go over here, you would see it's just this one thing, and it's actually kind of at an angle, and there's some stuff here. It's a optical illusion basically, but it's extremely well done because they had to do that for every instance in which you could see the Citadel, and mind you, it has to be different each time because you're seeing it at a different angle. And B, it enabled the developers to do exactly what I'm about to mention with an actual three-dimensional render, with an actual mesh over here of the Citadel, rather than, Barney looking up and saying, wow, I've never seen the Citadel lit up like that before. You see, wow, I've never seen the Citadel lit up like that before. And you see the Citadel actually moving, and whole chunks of it opening up, and scores upon scores of something flying out of it. All of this stuff wouldn't have been possible, or at least not nearly as effective, with just a pattern or a texture on a skybox, or something that has been rendered in a two-dimensional plane in a distance. You know what I mean? Incredible design technique, and very, very difficult to pull off, very, very tedious, but worth it. And indeed, it's that whole raising the bar thing again. Usage of music, that's my next note here. I'm going to mention the lesser point first, so I don't forget about this and it gets swallowed up by the main point. One of the things that I've discovered very quickly is that when you pause, there's actually custom sounds that start playing. Those sounds are dependent upon where you are. It's basically ambient sounds based on where you're at the moment, right? And so, if you happen to be in a region where you're under the sewers or whatever, or you're on the beach, what you're going to be hearing is going to be dependent upon that. That's such a minor little touch, and yet so beautiful in its own right, because it again adds to that feeling of, okay, here's where I'm at right now, rather than pausing and it going to some kind of elevator music, or perhaps just continuing whatever sounds it was. You actually get a completely different feel. So A, you're paused, but B, you still know where you're at. And obviously you could be, well, of course you're paused. You paused the game. In which case you're kind of missing the point, and I apologize for not explaining it better. The point is it adds another layer to it. It adds one additional layer of immersion, even to the pause menu. My God, man, how many people do that? I can't think of many. Let's get to the main point, the usage of music, which is extremely well done. I've talked before about the two primary thought processes and methodologies that go into music in video games. You can either have music that is part of the scene, overwhelming, and, I don't know how to describe this better. I want to just use an example. The difference between Mass Effect and Final Fantasy VI, okay? Now, as I've said before, I have nothing against Mass Effect's music, but Mass Effect's music was ultimately designed, with a few exceptions, to be in the background. It was designed to be something because if it wasn't there, you would notice it. And this is true. In any given game, if the music is taken away, the game feels different. Most people know this. It's because we as gamers have had music in the back of our game for so long that when you remove it, its absence is noticeable. You with me? This is just basic design philosophy here. And then you have other games which very actively try to have, da, 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 da. And if you actually recognize that song, then I don't know what to say. It's the opera. I'll go ahead and tell you. It's the beginning of the opera from FF6. But you get my point. Very powerful, very in the forefront. It's a part of the story you're telling. Half-Life 2 does both. Bear with me on this. Vast portions of the game have no music. And again, this was actually done on purpose. You have zero music, zero sound coming through on this music track, specifically to emphasize the fact that it's not there. It is done in the service of the atmosphere, in the service of whatever that scene should be. And any given moment at which you're supposed to be tense or quiet or whatever, there's only one of two things happening. Either there's no music at all, or there's a very quiet almost a continuous tone going in the background. If you know what I mean. If you've played the game, you know what I'm talking about. Ravenholm comes to mind immediately. It's just this, it's almost Metroid-like in its quiet pronunciation of the tone of the scene. And then anytime that's supposed to be some powerful emotion, some action or adventure, or it's like, yes, music comes out of nowhere, and it's always very high-paced, very actiony, very epic, almost heavy guitar, rock, metal, whatever you want to call it, just da 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 da, that kind of music. And every time it happens, it is again in service of the story. The first time you hop in the buggy, it's like, yeah, da 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 da. The first time you get the crowbar, when you when you start the assault on the four striders, there's every sequence where it's supposed to be really high paced or action, and that's supposed to be a major point. The music is in complement to it, and then we thus notice the absence even more, and they can play with that. They can kind of make you think, oh, okay, well this area is just going to be this quiet, horrible thing. And I'll talk about that more when I get to the urban warfare section. It's going to be one of the last things I talk about here. Oh my goodness. The directing in this game is nothing short of phenomenal. One of the tricks, one of the things that people do in directing is called establishment. Okay, I'm not sure if that's the direct movie literary whatever term, but that's what I call it. Let me give you an example just to go into what I'm talking about really quick. Those of you out there who have seen Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, right towards the beginning, during the Kobayashi Maru scenario, one of the things they say is raise shield, and the camera actually pans over and shows this little graphic of now part of you may be thinking, well, why even bother doing that? That feels like fluff or pattern. That is actually establishment, because now the audience knows what that means. Nobody came out and said, when these lights light up, this means the shield has gone up on the ship. But we now know that's what that means because we are capable of putting two and two together, right? That's establishment. Thus, later on, when it becomes a major plot point that the shields are dropping on the other ship, or when your own shields aren't up, that we know what that means immediately. We don't have to have it explained to us. Half-Life 2 uses this extensively, and there's one specific instance of it I really want to call out and applaud. Right prior to us getting a hold of the land boat buggy thing, we hear the words, basically they're shelling us, and that's it. And we start to see artillery shells come in. Now, my first thought when I was first playing this is the obvious, because I know what artillery shells are, and I know what they can do. And so it's like, oh god! But then what we see is the backs of these shells open up, and headcrabs start to come out. Now, anybody who's played Half-Life 1 knows immediately what a headcrab is and what the threat they pose. And I'll talk about headcrabs a little bit more in just a second, but let's just move on with this point. So this thing pops up, the headcrabs pop out, and they go after the people. We actually, one of the beautiful things, though, is if you haven't played Half-Life 1, we see a person get headcrabbed right towards the beginning of Half-Life 2, and in fact, it's incredibly obvious what's happening the moment you start to see people wandering around with headcrabs on their heads, and they're groaning like zombies and stuff like that, It takes no time at all to explain what's happening, even though nobody actually comes out and says, so what happens is headcrabs are popped out of these things that are shot by the Combine as sort of a method. Nobody has to explain all this. We get it. It is displayed for us, and we can put two and two together. It's not subtle. It is treating you like you have a brain, which is something I've talked about many times and something I enjoy. Why is this awesome? One of the things they mention many times is that going to Ravenholm is a bad idea. They never say why. Then we get to Ravenholm, and we walk out, and the very first thing we see, very first thing, is one of those shells. Already open. It's been there for however long. It isn't even smoking anymore. It's just there. And that's all we need to see, because we know exactly what that means now that it has been established. You understand me here? That simple thing sent a chill down my spine. And mind you, I've played this game before. I knew what was happening going into Ravenholm, but just seeing that was just, it's powerful. And the whole Ravenholm sequence is what I was calling out in the visceral horror section I mentioned earlier. This is where I talk about headcrabs. I'm sorry, I'm kind of stuttering into it. I actually had a nightmare about this. I feel almost ashamed to admit this, but it is true. It was screwed up, and I'm not going to share it. I don't want to think about it. But This whole section, granted I've been playing a lot of Half-Life lately, but whatever. This whole section still gets to me even to this day. I wouldn't say it scares me per se because I'm not sure scared is the emotion I'm feeling at the time. It's more like panic, something along those lines. Allow me to explain in a way that a gamer who has played Half-Life 2 will understand. I actually almost ran out of ammunition in Ravenholm. Now let me rewind and explain that to anybody who doesn't get the importance of that sentence. In Ravenholm, you have just gotten the gravity gun. It is your latest toy, and Ravenholm is built for it. There are saw blades, there are tons of pieces of movable debris, more so than almost any other part of the game, actually. This whole section is designed that you can use nothing but the gravity gun. And also, as anybody who's played the game knows, the headcrabs themselves can actually be attacked by the gravity gun. They're one of the only enemies in the whole game that can take damage just from the gravity gun itself, without hitting them with anything, just blasting them with it. And yet, headcrabs and the zombies and the leaper zombies all bother me so much that I found myself flailing for my machine gun just because I wanted them to die now, please? you know? And so I almost ran out of ammunition in Ravenholm, the place where you're not even supposed to use your guns, because that's how effective it was. Even on a replay, even knowing what I was walking into, I was going through there like, and it is, I say it again, it is very visceral. It is very gory, very violent, very bloody, very horrifying type of horror. It's not particularly subtle. The most subtlety you'll get is the fact that most of the time you usually have to do a few blasts in order to see if that corpse is actually a corpse or just a zombie who happens to be resting for the moment. Um, but the whole thing is never. You know what? I'm actually gonna take that back because there is some subtlety in the design of the level. See, most people don't understand this, but lighting in a video game is something that it doesn't happen by accident. The only reason that that wall is visible is because some guy's job was to make sure that the lighting sources in the game were reflected off of it at the right time and the right angle. It is something that you have to make happen. It doesn't just happen. What I mean by that, then, is that when you have a section that isn't lit up, that you need the flashlight to see at all, you know what I'm talking about if you've played this game. There are certain sections of the game, especially in Ravenholm, where it is literally pure pitch black. You cannot see anything there because there is no lighting providing light to it. It is literally a vacuum of light, and therefore you can't see it at all unless you turn the flashlight on it. What they do with the design of Ravenholm and so many of the levels is you'll walk into the. I'll give you a specific example because this one caught me and I was just blown away by this. Um, you're in this room, okay? Now, in this room, there's the entrance over here, and there's the exit over here. And you walk in, there's a few zombies. Now, I'm going to go ahead and tell you the point now. I'm going to give it away. Over here, there's this little closet area. This area is not lit at all. This section is poorly lit. So it goes from wall into slowly fading darkness until you can't see anything, and it looks like it's just a corner. Unless you're looking right at it, you can't tell this is a closet. And there are some zombies over here ready for you. That is bloody amazing. Forgive me for my British colloquialisms, but you get the point. That type of design is incredible, and again, it's very visceral. It's very startling horror, is what I like to call that. As opposed to being, genuinely horrified and walking around just in this constant state of paranoia. It's more like genuinely horrified because you don't know what's going to jump out at you next, and you're twitchy. Yeah, you understand me? And that's a beautiful example of that. So yeah, I blew through a lot of ammo going through Ravenholm. But I have to give Ravenholm very genuine praise, not just because of how absolutely frickin' terrifying it is, but the whole presentation of that place was amazing. Father Grigori is stellar. I mentioned a lot of characters before. This is one I actually went out of my way not to mention because he deserves his own little section. Father Grigori is another one of those characters that I've heard a lot of interpretations of, and I'm still undecided myself. Is he mad? Is he someone who has completely lost his mind and turned to religion in the face of the horrors that are facing him? Is he someone who was always religious and now actually genuinely believes what he says about, trying to save his people? And there's a sequence later on where you're actually escorting him as you're getting your way through the graveyard, where he says he's talking to these zombies, yelling at him as he's shooting him with the shotgun, let me save you, let me end your pain, I'm sorry I can't do more, stuff like that. Does he mean that? Or is he just a raving madman? You don't know, and it's left for you to decide. And again, I'm still kind of torn because the voice actor does an amazing job with it. And even despite his, of course he's going to be laughing. Of course he's unhinged. Of course he's suffering severe mental trauma. Duh, if you'll forgive me for being so blunt, given the circumstances of Ravenholm. And yet, one of the things that is really, really subtle about Ravenholm, and I know several people who never actually picked up on this, is as you're going through, there are actual vocal screams in the background, not zombies. Clearly humanoid screams that are not Grigori. From that simple auditory fact, we can deduce something. That we are not the only survivors, that Grigori is not the only survivor, that there are other people still trying to make it through this place. And this is one of the reasons why I think it makes so much sense that all of the traps he set up for the zombies are so easy to circumvent if you're human. Thus, anybody who is paying any attention at all can avoid the car smashing traps and the spinning blade things and all that stuff, while the zombies are literally completely caught off guard by them. Because there are other survivors in the town, and he's still trying to help them. And thus it brings up another question. How much guilt does Grigori feel over this? When he speaks about his flock, the implication is he's talking about the people that, have been zombified. Is it possible he's talking about those other survivors that he's been trying to assist while trying to remain unzombified himself? There's a lot of layers to this place, and ultimately this is basically just a horrible, Resident Evil taken to extreme area, and yet it is so well done. All the way up until the very end when you actually leave, and Father Grigori says, take, I forget the line, I'm sorry, but he starts laughing, and the music swells for just a second, and you hear this deep church organ, and you hear the bell of the church bells going clong, clong, and he's like, and in my particular game, he actually went charging into a raging inferno that happened to be nearby. I don't know if that's designed intentionally scripted to be that way or not. I don't think it was because he was actually kind of backing away from the zombies who were coming onto him and, into the fire. And I was just like, you know, my God, man. Let's see. What else have we got here? Immediately after Ravenholm, what happens? You leave the place and you emerge into the sunlight, kind of literally. And you look around and you're like, okay. And you're walking along and you see a couple zombies and they're kind of ignoring you because you're still actually in the outskirts of Ravenholm basically at this point. This is still an area that has been shelled, if you understand me. And then we're introduced to the snipers. Now, I admit, I've played video games for a long time, so it occurred to me without question or hesitation what to do about the snipers immediately. Grenade! Didn't even, no hesitation. It was just like being asked, what do you do when you see a Goomba coming after you? Oh, hop. Duh. But I know several people who got to that point and then died because they just started unloading with whatever weapons they had, trying to, pull one of those explosive cans and shoot it up there. Couldn't figure out how to kill these guys. I'm like, grenade them, dude. Oh. But my reason for bringing this up is that, well, I kind of want to talk about this towards the end, but I'll just mention it briefly. I've talked about pacing before a lot, and I've talked about pacing in Half-Life. Half-Life 2 has the exact same approach to pacing that Half-Life does. Everything has a counterbalance, and immediately after we start in Ravenholm down here. It's very creepy, it's very still, and we encounter the occasional zombie, and it ramps up very quickly, especially when the leapers get involved, and we go through that last blowing the heck out of everything, just swarms upon swarms of zombies in the graveyard, and then it builds and builds and builds and builds, and then it absolutely plummets. And then we stay down here in this state of, actually it's a little bit higher than this, in this state of sheer tension. You can actually see my hand shaking, my hands shake in general, actually, that's unrelated. But, this is excellent to demonstrate the point here, we're just shaking here as we're going along, and then there's the sniper! Okay, run to the next spot, okay, And then the action stays relatively moderate until we get to the point where we get the damn truck, the car thing, and then it ramps right up again as we're blazing at full speed across the countryside, fighting and blowing the heck out of everything we come across. It does this thing, but it does it properly. This is what pacing should be. Pacing shouldn't be this. Pacing shouldn't be this. Pacing should be this. To some extent or another, it should equalize. It should balance out, and Half-Life 2 does that beautifully. And then I actually ran out of room on my pad here, and I didn't want to keep going. But I want to mention a couple of things here that are just from remembering. I did just beat the game 10 minutes before I started recording here. Immediately upon uh, getting the bike, you come to the lighthouse area. After you finish the whole biking sequence. Actually, I'm going to rewind a bit because this whole section, known as highway. You know what? Let's rewind one more step. I apologize. There's one other thing I really wanted to talk about. I thought about mentioning it in Half-Life, but in Half-Life 2 it's much more effective. Half-Life and Half-Life 2 both went out of their way to occasionally have a little subtitle come up. And this is the name of the chapter you're in the game, okay? Now, why do that? As usual, it was in service of the story. When you see that subtitle pop up, it's usually indicative of what it is they want to... It's one of those reaction moments again. They want you to react to that. The perfect example of this is we don't go to Ravenholm. Or we don't go to Ravenholm anymore. I forget what exactly it is, but you know, that one. When that pops up, you're already tense because you're entering this place. You're already tense because you saw the pod. And then that pops up and it's just like, okay, you know? And then one will pop up which is like very quiet. I like quiet emphasis, the kind of thing where you say something very quietly and very stillly, and it means so much. The best example of this is probably Anti-Citizen 1, or whatever it is, right towards the end. It's like the third to last sequence. Or how about the actual last sequence, which is Our Benefactors? It's something so quiet, and yet it means so much that the reaction to that is just, yes, let's do this, I'm ready. Follow Freeman is another excellent example of that. Highway is this sequence, and I love that because this whole sequence is very high-paced, very actiony, lots of, you're going very, very fast, and you can lose control of this vehicle very, very easily, let me tell you. And yet, the most subtle point in all of Half-Life 2 that is a major point, that is an actual plot point, and indeed a setting point, is in this sequence. I love this. Throughout this sequence, what we find is that the water levels of the ocean have dropped. Now, those of you out there who know what that means, in real life terms, I want I don't have to say anything else, but for those of you who don't, think about for a moment how much water would have to be removed for the water levels of an ocean to be lowered. Even a foot, even 1 foot, would require massive, massive amounts of water. What we see is that the actual water lines have lowered by something along the lines of 20 to 30 feet, which is insane. And as we're going throughout Highway, we see this over and over and over again, and it's all in the background. It's over there onto the side. We don't have to look at it. But that was the first thing that caught my attention. Even when I was replaying this time, I couldn't tilt my camera away from it sometimes. I actually ended up crashing sometimes because I'm just staring at a boat that is beached out there because the water levels have lowered so far, or the pier that isn't actually going out to the water anymore because the water's another 100 feet down the line. That point speaks volumes by itself. Now, we have learned since then that one of the things that the Combine has been doing is draining resources off of the planet, and indeed, its water is one of them. But even without knowing that point, that conclusion is obvious. And not only that, but it's obvious they've been doing it for a long time, have done it a lot, and we can't. I could not even begin to calculate the effects that would have on the environment, on the ecosystem, on multiple ecosystems. That is mind-numbing and incredibly powerful stuff because this is what I like to call the psychological horror, because there's nothing overtly terrifying about it other than what you think about it, if you follow what I mean. And the more you think about it, the more horrifying it gets. As you start to realize just how screwed the planet has to be. This whole game occurs in and around a single city somewhere in Europe or the Russian area. There's several facts we can infer, and there's several theories about where the city is set. Regardless, this is just one small portion of the overall problem that the entire planet is facing. And the question comes up not... I've mentioned before, is this world worth saving? And I think how most games and stories should ask that question. Half-Life 2 never asked that question. Half-Life 2 asks the question, can this world be saved? And it does so without ever saying a word. And that's one of the reasons I love this game so much. Immediately after that sequence... sorry. I'm a little snuffly right now. I'm sorry, during the sequence, we also get another one of those little tutorial things. This is how you take down a gunship, and we learn. It's actually kind of irritating, but especially on hard difficulty. My God, but that was important because it's a good way to get it across. It's a good way to make the point that we should be afraid of gunships, that they're a big deal. And later on, when we get to the Fall of Freeman chapter, and we start fighting those things in multiples, or at least one, and then another like a half an hour later, we know what we're doing immediately, and we're immediately trying to do everything we can in order to make that happen. Um, Also, on top of that, there's one little detail I really enjoy. There's a map that you keep seeing. You saw it in the East Mesa area. You saw it at the light post outpost. Just about every outpost you come across on the way, you see this map of the region, and it actually is an accurate map of the region, believe it or not. Now, obviously, the road you take is not the one you take on the map because the map is out of date, but I thought that was a nice little touch. I also have to mention one other thing, and that's the car battery puzzle. Anybody who's played this game probably knows exactly what I'm talking about. I freely admit that when I first played this game, I had to look that one up. Would you like to know why? Because as a gamer, my first inclination was that I had to use the two batteries I had in some combination in order to make the circuit complete. It never occurred to me that there might be a third battery in a car. Now, granted, if you remove gamer logic from it and just look at it logically, yeah, okay, let's get a third battery from one of these cars. But the problem with, and I'll talk about this more when I get to other games, but gamer logic is basically something that says if it has not been demonstrated to happen, I have no reason to believe it is possible within this game. And I had that problem a lot in Half-Life 2 because every now and again something would be possible that otherwise wouldn't be just for this one puzzle or this one section. And I'm not saying that's a downside, by the way, quite the contrary. I am simply explaining why it is that I had to look up things on more than one occasion, and I'm a little bit embarrassed about that, admittedly, but this is one of those examples. Now, this time through, of course, I knew it was in a car. I don't remember which, but that's not hard at that point. Just go looking through the cars. Ah, here's a battery. Boom, done. But I was stuck at that point for so long the first time I played this game. And then we get to the bridge sequence. I already talked about the bridge sequence and the horribleness of it. Ooh, the shudderingness of it. And you get through the bridge sequence. You get on the awesome thing. You have to have the the frickin' chicken. You play chicken with a train, and you have to win because if your little cart even touches the train, it's considered to be destroyed, and the game ends. And then you get to the lighthouse, you fight off the gunship, and there's that moment I mentioned earlier about the car being taken off and all the people being murdered. At least you assume, because you've never actually shown that. And then we get to the antlion section. I'm kind of running through this because I've already talked about so many of these sequences already. But one of the things I really do enjoy is the option of choice. The antlion sequence is probably the best example of this in this whole game. Here's this whole area. The sand is lava, okay? You touch sand, bad happens. Now, there's also going to be a boss later on, so you probably want to be conserving your ammunition and firepower and whatnot. But you do have the option of just running. You can just hop on the sand and just go, yeah. And I do distinctly recall having done that at least one of my playthroughs, and it works. It's a little hectic, and I had a little less health at the end than when I started, but it does work. Or, if you feel like having the patience and you have the dexterity or inclination, you can actually lay out the pieces of debris across the beach so you can go. Now, one of the things I love about this sequence, though, and this ties into the overall theme of Half-Life 2, which I'm not going to talk about just yet, is there is a mentality human beings tend to have where the only difference between something you hate and something you care about and love is whether or not it is yours or not. Now let me try and elaborate on this a little bit. I'll use the direct example rather than trying to use an analogy. I will talk about what happens here in the game. Those antlions are your worst enemy, and you hate them every time they pop up, and you step on the stand, and they come out, and they're like, and they fly, for God's sakes. They are all over the place, and you hate them. Until the moment at which they become your loyal followers. At that point, everything changes. The entire mentality changes. They go from being these hated enemies to effectively your own companions, your pets, and they are ridiculously loyal. They will fling themselves into danger's way in order to try and help you and save you if you are under attack. And with a flip of a switch, all of a sudden they go from being your enemy to your ally and something you care about. And I don't know about several of you, but I actually went out of my way to try and save as many antlands as I could just because it's me, because it was like, these are my guys now, and they are no longer my enemy, and now I have to do everything I can to help them. That may be hypocritical, I don't know. That's something that needs to be debated in a context that doesn't involve giant bugs. But you get where I'm going with this. I want to go ahead and talk about Nova Prospect briefly, and then I'll talk about the theme, okay? Nova Prospect is an awesome, awesome sequence. It has puzzle platforming, it has danger, it has tension, it has very heavy action sequences. It has what most people consider to be the hardest portion of the game, and I actually find myself in agreement on that. When you have to defend against the waves upon waves of guys with 3 turrets, that's pretty easy on easy difficulty. I know this from experience. Trying it on hard is not very easy. Hoo-ha. Um, you ever want to feel the true tension of that scene, do yourself a favor, save right before it, and crank the difficulty into hard if it's not already, and then play through it. Oh my god. Um, now yes, I did make it. I didn't actually have to reload or anything. I didn't die, believe it or not. But it was still quite intense. And yeah, one of the beautiful parts about the Nova Prospect scene is that it's the moment at which we are shown another layer of the truth. Now let me try and explain this. The very first chunk of the game, all the way up until you get the crowbar, is the Combine are omnipresent and omnipotent. They are all over on top of everything. They find out exactly where everyone is, and they know exactly where you are and where you're going. They take out the stations and the Underground Railroad before you even reach them, you know? There is a very strong impression through their actions and to the way that we are introduced to them, that the Combine is on top of things, that they are the unstoppable force, and there's nothing we can do about it. And even towards the end, we find out that they were already at Mesa East, and they've already taken out Ravenholm. They've won basically, right? Nova Prospect is where we see another layer of that. We see the Combine at their worst. They are just barely keeping up. Their things are degenerate to the point of almost laughable. Only a few facilities are actually fully functional. They're understaffed, undermanned for the most part. Until you really start raising hell, they have difficulty repulsing you at all. They are completely unprepared for the antlions. What we see in Nova Prospect, and this was done on purpose, I know, because I've seen all the backstory and the making of stuff. What we see in Nova Prospect is the fact that the Combine is not invincible, and this is the perfect time in which to do it from a literary perspective. Build up the villain, but do it in a believable way, so that they seem like we cannot stop them until we get to this one point, in this overall journey right here, and this is the finale right here. And at this point we learn they are not invincible, they are not all-powerful, they can be beaten. That paves the way from an in-lore perspective and from a perspective as a story to us, the viewer, the gamer, that now we can actually stop them. Now it is possible. Now we know we can bleed them. I mentioned this in my ending to my alternate ending of the Mass Effect 3, and obviously I would have elaborated on that much more if I actually had my way and choice on the matter. But that would have been a pivotal point, and that would have been the exact same type of point within that ending. This is the moment at which we learn, and all the people involved learn, our enemy isn't invincible. They have been trying very hard to appear like they are, because they know that it's easier to oppress someone who doesn't think they can fight back. But the moment we know we can fight back, it'll be bloody and it'll hurt, but we can, and that is the important part right there that I'm getting at. And from that point on, the whole tone of the entire story takes a completely different viewpoint. Brilliantly done, brilliantly done. Now, I'm going to go ahead and pause here to talk about, I'm not going to stop the video, to talk about the theme of Half-Life 2. Half-Life 2's theme is humanity. What it means to be human. Let me give you 3 viewpoint characters on this theme that really help highlight it. They use a triple system, a triad if you prefer. On the one side, we see someone who is intellectual to the point of extremism, who believes that survival and evolution and progress are all that matter, who literally thinks in terms of numbers rather than the metaphysical or the intangible. I am, of course, referring to Dr. Breen, over here on this side. Then we meet someone, and indeed several people, but someone who most strongly personifies this, who believes in the exact opposite. Though he understands the math, he understands the science, he understands the evolution behind it. He believes in the intangible, the fact that societal interactions matter. And what I mean by that is from a purely crass, from Dr. Bean's perspective, the relevance of a loved one isn't, if you understand what I mean. The only purpose in a relationship is to procreate, to keep the species going. From Eli Vance's perspective, the only purpose in a relationship is to be with someone who loves you. And that is an intangible. That is something that is not, you cannot put a number on, you cannot factually define. And that is another side of humanity, and he's over here. I've heard a lot of complaints about Edith Mossman, and I actually defend her because I think she is arguably the single most human character in all of this. Because she is right in the middle of this. In Edith, we see someone who is portrayed as genuinely believing what Brain is saying to some extent, but not to an extreme. In Edith, we see someone who does think about the numbers, does think about the evolution, does think about the process, but is still tempered by the fact that she still cares about the intangibles. She still cares about Eli. She still cares about her reactions with other people. She still cares what people think of her. She still holds on to her envy with regards to Gordon Freeman and all he does. None of these things are logical or in favor of the survival of the species, and yet she has them nonetheless. And so much of her confusion and her portrayal comes from being someone who is in between those two extremes and torn about it. And in Edith Mossman, we see someone who is genuinely layered, someone who is human. And that is what this entire game is about in its nutshell, what it means to be human, and why that matters. And I think it does so brilliantly. It actually almost brought me to tears when the realization hit me. It didn't actually hit me until this time through, because, I had my analysis brain really engaged. We see so many different sides of things. We see people who have given up. We see people who have given up and surrendered. We have see people who have decided to engage in activities that they believe will at least help. We have seen people who have fought back against that. We have seen people who have rebelled just because they don't know what's going on. We see people who are confused. We see people who are crazy. We see people who are resigned. We see so many different sides of humanity, and every single one of them is designed to paint this picture. I mentioned way back that I was going to mention this later, the details thing, why the details really matter. This is an art term, okay? This is not a literary device. This is something you do in artwork. When you are trying to paint a picture, one of the ways that you can do that's very difficult and very time-consuming is to actually paint it as 1,000 different pictures. No, I'm not explaining this very well, so forgive me. Let me give you a direct example. I once designed a city, okay, and I drew a picture of it. I feel like I'm being so disingenuous. This took me months. This was a huge project, okay? This was a big old poster. I can't even get my arms big enough, detail upon detail. Now, I had choices. There's a minimalist style, which basically would mean, rather than drawing each one of these bricks on the wall, you draw the outline of some bricks in certain patterns, thus that the viewer actually gets the point that that's a bricked wall, right? I didn't do that. I drew every city block. All of them. Now, as you're looking in that picture, you're not seeing, oh, there's a hotel. Oh, there's a little theater. Oh, there's a grocery store. That's not what you're seeing. What you're seeing is 50 dozen things all at once, which paints the picture. You with me? Thus, when you use this style of detailing, of really going into this and having dozens upon dozens of details, you paint the picture with 1,000 different pictures. You're not looking at any one of them individually. You may point them out, you may notice them if someone else points them out or whatever, but ultimately it is the overall effect of all of them combined that actually creates the image that you're looking at. This is what Half-Life 2 does. All the details I mentioned, all the little things between the auditory and the visual and the presentation, everything is all details designed to paint the entire game by painting it 1,000 different times in 1,000 different little ways. You understand? This is one of the reasons I call Half-Life 2, without question, without hesitation, a work of art, a genuine work of beauty. Even if you do not enjoy this style of gameplay that this is, I again implore you, play this game. This is a joy that should be shared because of how amazing it is, how amazing it came together. I cannot believe we got a game like this in the day and era that it came out. This was post 2000, mind you, and that was at a point in time which gaming was kind of having a bit of a slump. It is arguable that Half-Life 2 rescued us from that slump. This is nothing short of incredible. Now, I want to talk about. I want to start ramping this down and start talking about the end game. I can put this away now. Nothing left there and there. It's actually warm from sitting on the laptop. It is an interesting irony that so many games that have urban warfare in them, and indeed are about urban warfare, pale utterly in comparison to the way it is portrayed in Half-Life 2. Again, I'm going to use a single sentence to explain this whole sequence between anti-citizen number one and when you get to our benefactors. And that is, I was constantly out of ammunition. Now let me try and explain this a bit for anybody who doesn't really get that. First part of the game you have nothing, up until the crowbar. And from that point up until, assuming you did Ravenholm properly, from that point up until the point in which you reach Anti-Citizen 1, you're swimming in ammunition. You have so much of it that you can't spend it as fast. And you could literally start shooting into the air, and by the time you take down the next squad, you're good again. You follow me? It is plentiful, and you never need that much of it. And yet I reached this sequence, and there was so much constant, unending, unceasing fighting, no matter where I turned, no matter how I did it. There were enemies everywhere, and I was basically constantly holding down the trigger. Not literally, of course. Let me actually point this out. I'm not a bad gamer. I guess that's probably obvious based on everything you know about me, but I'm not. I'm not a bad gamer. I'm not great. I'm not one of the best guys in the world or whatever. But I know how to play this. I mean, I was playing Half-Life 2 on hard and managed to do so with only a few deaths. I think that's a pretty decent achievement, all things considered. But I mention that not to be like, oh, I'm great, not to try and push my ego, but just to emphasize the fact that despite the fact that I was being conservative with my ammunition, despite the fact that I was trying to be very careful about how I was fighting and making sure I was using cover properly and making sure I was using every trick I had at my disposal and using the gravity gun whenever I could, I was still in a constant emptiness of ammunition. I was constantly out of resources. I was constantly low on health because that whole sequence is just non-stop war. I don't have a better word for it. And it's urban warfare. And for anybody out there who knows what that means, especially in real life terms, you know just why it was so bloody and so brutal. I felt so bad because there's no way in hell I could save all the people. All the little companions who were like, Freeman, I want to come with you. I had no idea how to save those people because so many times they couldn't live through the sequences that we'd go through. It was ridiculous. And that's just kind of how urban warfare is. But, pardon me, I have to mention this because the way it portrays it is extremely brutal and violent, and what we have here is what is effectively the last dungeon. I mention that because in most games, the last dungeon is the hardest, the most brutal, and the final ramp up to the last boss, right? Let's bring this back to the pacing issue. This whole sequence, the 2 full chapters of urban warfare, is just this. Culminating in a fight against, well, I shouldn't even say culminating, because then you fight 4 Striders at once. And then you fight more Striders while going through buildings that they are destroying as you're going through them, which are also infested by Combine. And then you do the last, you finally fight the last Strider and the last things, and then finally Dog shows up, and then you enter the Citadel. And then, after having done this massive build-up towards that last big fight in that one ruined building right at the end there, it does this. And then it does something curious. As you're going through the Citadel, as you're going through our benefactors, the overall tone, the overall pace is doing this again. It's slowly rising. And there's one other wonderful thing that they did that was one of the most brilliant things I've seen. At this point, we are no longer afraid of our enemy. Everything I mentioned before was hazardous, was dangerous, was hectic, was a constant struggle to survive. And then we enter the Citadel, and we lose all our weapons, and it's like, except the gravity gun. The gravity gun gets supercharged. We then get the Uber gravity gun. Those of you who have played any game ever know about the concept of the gun. Let me explain in case I'm using a term that you have not heard it spoken in. The earliest example this can usually be pulled back to is Doom. In Doom, it was called the BFG. You know what the BFG is, and you know what it can do. That was the gun. Now, it's usually called that because most of the early examples and most of the most powerful examples are in first-person shooters. But in just about any game, there is something that is the gun. This is at the point at which you get this weapon. It is on. You have officially reached the pinnacle. You have crawled your way through the difficult, through the mind-numbing, through the near impossible, and you have now become more powerful than anything else in this setting. Because now you have the gun. You understand the mentality here, the mindset? Now, it isn't always necessarily a gun, of course. Sometimes it's the power, sometimes you reach a certain level, sometimes it's a sword. In Half-Life 2, the gun is the improved gravity gun. At that point, you are God. You are no longer capable of being stopped by anything. And you just lay waste to the Citadel. That was after having after having just barely gotten through the whole urban warfare sequence. I actually died once in that whole period. To the Striders, by the way, for anyone who's curious. But it was still, even though I only died once, it was still hectic. It was still, I felt like I was, just, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, the whole time. Then I got the gun. And now it's like, oh, just bring it, I'm ready now. That really adds to the whole you can interpret this sequence however you want thing, because I've heard several different ways people have interpreted this final sequence. I mentioned it does this, and that's because at this point you're no longer afraid. One way or another, the fear has been removed from the equation. So however you interpret it, either you have now become someone who is pissed off and ready to take this down, or either of you finally reached the point at which the adrenaline high has gotten over everything and you're no longer basically conscious, or my own personal interpretation, which I actually really enjoy, if you'll forgive me for sharing, is that you have basically become the avatar of humanity itself, and you are walking through there like a righteous death wave of doom that is now going to say, no, 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 this has gone on far enough, and now I'm going to show you why. No matter how you interpret it, though, that last sequence is amazing, and it does just ramp up all the way up. Even when you have the pause, when Dr. Breen captures you, and then you have the wonderful conversation, and then you get to the end thing, and Breen dies, and the explosion happens, it's still a ramp up. And then Half-Life 2 pulls a twist on you. I mentioned before that I've mentioned this many times, and I'll probably mention this again, that the formula in the finale, in the end boss, in the ending, and any epilogue, almost universally is a basic slant like this, and usually maybe a pull off towards a small drop off towards the end there in the epilogue, right? That this is very standard. This is what I like to call the epic ending. But as I've said before, that is not the only way to do it. Half-Life 1 didn't do that. Half-Life 1 did literally the opposite. Half-Life 1 started from here and just plummeted until it got to the point where the last boss was like way down here, and then it kept going down. Even as you get to the actual ending sequence, it actually was even further down in overall tone and overall pace. Brilliant. Earthbound is another excellent example of a game like that. Just to give you one right off the top of my head, Half-Life 2 manages to do something even more interesting. After the and then the slow rise, it then stops dead. It completely stops dead, and we find the G-Man there telling us that once again we have a choice, that we've done it, and he gives some interesting little tidbits. And then we face ourselves with a choice. Now, I'm going to go ahead and talk about this here. I've been alluding to it this whole time. Why am I not reviewing Episode 1 and Episode 2 in this? Two very big reasons. There's actually several reasons, but the two ones are the biggest. Number one, Half-Life 2 feels like a complete game without the addition of the episodes. I mean this strongly. It comes full circle. It really does. The beginning to the ending, it even bookends it properly. Two, Half-Life Episode 1 and Half-Life Episode 2 are part of a story that has not yet been finished because it has been over 6 years now And that's, by the way, the most generous number. You can actually increase that depending on how less inclined you're being to being generous. Since we have heard anything about Episode 3, or indeed at this point we might as well just call it Half-Life 3. Now let's be fair, yes, I understand that what they probably were doing was trying the episodic format and decided it didn't work and wanted to go back to the epic long-term development plan, which is a viable development plan. That's something that does work. I just kind of wish they had done that to begin with, but whatever, they tried. I'm not going to be too upset about the matter. But my point is, Half-Life. I have played Episode 1 and Episode 2 for anybody who's wondering, obviously. But as far as I'm concerned, at the moment they don't exist. If you follow my meaning. Okay, they were fun, but then the creator decided let's go a different direction. So okay, we'll just file those away under didn't happen, and not think about it. I've only played Episode 1 and Episode 2 once each, and that's it. And that's all I actually intend to until Half-Life 3 comes out. And there's actually been a lot of talk that Episode 1 and Episode 2 will be bundled as a part of Half-Life 3, which is probably a good idea in all honesty. But Half-Life 2, even if you never played Half-Life, you don't actually have to. Half-Life 1 was something of a whole story. It kind of ended on a cliffhanger, sort of, as most things weren't explained. But Half-Life 2, while there were plenty of mysteries left over, the story of Half-Life 2 actually did come full circle quite succinctly. And I want to stress that I really love the way they bookended it. At the very beginning, you're brought out of whatever stasis it is you're in, or whatever it is that G-Man does with you, and he has that beautiful line. And then right at the end, you have succeeded in destroying the Citadel. And even if not knowing what happens in Episode 1 and 2, we know that this is now a turning point. We already knew that the Combine wasn't invincible. We learned that in Nova Prospect. We already know that we have some technology that they don't. We learned that towards the beginning of the game. We find out that we actually have a chance of doing something in order to fight back. And this is the first real sign of that. The first true, no really, we have won. This is the Death Star blowing up here. And the massive impact on that cannot be overstated. And right at the end, we once again see the G-Man walking in, telling us to rise and shine, and to smell the ashes.